To welcome the next speaker, João Mordomo. Please come to me. I guess you had the longest way from Brazil, then USA, now Germany. That's a good trip. So you're on the edge between business and mission, and there is the slang of business as mission. So it's your time to give us a brief introduction into that business as mission.
I will, thank you. I'm on the edge, I'm on the ledge. I feel like I'm on the ledge. I'm going to fall off and crash and burn. We're getting into kind of tricky territory sometimes when we talk about business as mission. But just before I go, Jonathan, I kept waiting for you to use the phrase startup nation. I don't know if it's too cliche or if it's politically incorrect, but I was waiting to hear it.
You're not wrong, but I think Startup Nation is, I use a new one, it's Scale Up Nation. I just don't want to do what everybody's doing.
Right.
And I'm happy that you brought Startup Nation for me. That's good.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much.
We admire Israel because of that characteristic. And in fact, that has to do with what I'll talk about. When we talk about business as mission, entrepreneurship has, innovation, creativity has a lot to do with what we're talking about. So I'll start off with the definition. And then we'll unpack it. So we're going to have a definition. I know, sorry, it sounds a little bit too much like a classroom, but we'll unpack it, and it should be enjoyable. And then we'll hopefully get to some questions. Definition. If I say business as mission, what is it that I'm talking about? And I'm representing, there's not an orthodoxy behind this per se, but there is, it is somewhat standardized. But you need to know, at least when it comes out of my mouth, what am I talking about? So thank you for the invitation to be able to talk about this. Business as mission is the doxologically motivated, and remember, we're going to unpack this, strategic use of business activities, genuine business activities, to create genuine ministry opportunities, to bring about spiritual, economic, social, and environmental transformation to lives, families, communities, societies, and nations. So if we unpack that, the first thing that I said was it's doxologically motivated. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look through literature, or if you go back to classic virtues from Aristotle, or if you go to Aquinas, Augustine, or Calvin, or the Wesley brothers, you see the list gets larger, but you see these ideas of virtues that we understand can and should be manifest through business. But doxologically motivated backs us up one more step, and it says we're not just concerned about the common good, working out those virtues through business for the common good. We're also concerned about the King's glory. So if you're motivated by a desire to see the God of the universe glorified through genuine, authentic, creative, innovative business activities, then the common good takes care of itself. So doxologically motivated means for the glory of God. And we understand that if that's your driving passion, if that's what drives you, then common good genuinely results from that. So moving ahead of that motivation, now what if that's our foundation, what do we get to? We said genuine business activities. And for those who come from a business background, you might have snickered or snuffed. Snuffed is not even the word in English. I don't know what language I would use that word in this context. Just stick with snickered. You might have scoffed, I think is the word I wanted in English, because you're thinking, but of course, because all business theoretically is supposed to be real business, right? And this is the ledge I was talking about, because when we're talking about business and uniting it with a mission, very specifically a biblical gospel mission, then you've got people who are genuinely motivated but are going to go pretend like they're doing business, and they don't really do business. They just use it as an excuse to be in a place, or to get a visa, or to have people pay a little bit of attention to them. And so we say, just so that everybody will be at ease, when you hear somebody from a ministry background, a missions background, a pastoral background, talking about business as mission, we absolutely are talking about business that anybody in the world would understand to be real and good and genuine. And forgive me for saying this, or maybe don't, maybe you can applaud. Profit-driven business, we're looking at financial profit and the other types of profits that I mentioned, environmental and social and spiritual. So it's real, it's genuine, and it creates these opportunities to manifest what we understand in the biblical message. When you look at Genesis to Revelation, or when you look throughout redemptive history, this idea of a great and glorious God who desires and deserves to be known and worshiped through all activities, including business. When you look at that, you say, well, then absolutely, we should be using business for His glory. In other words, we're creating real ministry opportunities to bring about transformation. So I said authentic, but when I say authentic, it's real, it's genuine. Ministry opportunities that are created by virtue of that business existing. And then the transformation that I mentioned, which is, just think like this, fourfold return on your investment. It's not just one, it's not just financial, or fourfold bottom line, or corporate social responsibility plus. Add a fourth one, which is the spiritual component. So you're looking at this financial or economic, you're looking at this spiritual, you're looking at this social, and you're looking at an environmental bottom line or return on your investment, so that lives, families, communities, societies, and nations will be transformed in that fully orbed, that complete biblical gospel sense of transformation. So I'll give you one example, and then maybe we move into some questions. Colleagues of mine in Brazil, so boa tarde, by the way. Boa tarde. Anybody speak boa tarde? I know there's one out here that's going to say boa tarde to me. Boa tarde. So in Brazil, one of my activities includes actually leading an organization that some people would look at and say that's a mission organization, and they think in a conventional sense of missions, which is you train people theologically, and you send them, after they pastor a while in Brazil, then you send them overseas, maybe, preferably to an unreached nation or people group, and then they will go and evangelize and plant churches. And if you're feeling a little bit cynical, you might say proselytize because you don't like it. But you're thinking, okay, it's a conventional mission agency. We're not a conventional mission agency because we look at bringing all of these types of transformation, not just spiritual. Spiritual is ultimately what we are after. But we see in Scripture that there are other types of transformation that must occur together in that whole package. And so I have the privilege, among other things, of leading this particular organization. And one of the families that we had the privilege of sending to a country that ends in Stan, you'll have to take your pick. I'm not going to say which one it was. You have 7 options, at least in English. This, and I won't tell you the real names either, but we'll call them Marcos and Maria. And Marcos and Maria, when they finished university in Brazil, he was an engineer, trained for engineering. She ultimately became a university professor. And still in their 20s, they said, well, God, what if we go be missionaries? Would you like us to be missionaries? And God said, not now, but go to seminary. Part-time, go ahead and get your training, get some cross-cultural ministry skills, because maybe one day I will send you. And they were a little bit disappointed because they really wanted to go, but they didn't have that liberty yet. So Marcos established his career as an engineer in the city of São Paulo, so 20 plus million people. And Maria began to establish her career. They had 2 little kids, ultimately more. And around the age of 30, they knocked on God's door again and they said, well, is it now? Are you going to send us now? And God said, no. And they said, well, doggone it. They wouldn't have said that, but something similar in Portuguese. And then they continued to establish their family, to establish their careers, to establish Marcos' engineering firm in São Paulo. They knocked on God's door again, 10 years later, roughly 40 years old. God, is it now? Because we're kind of maybe halfway through our lives. So you ought to send us now, God, otherwise it may not even be worth it. God said, no, it's not now. And so a little bit disappointedly, but continuing firm in their faith, they pushed ahead. And by the time they hit around 50, and it wasn't literally every 10 years, but you understand what I'm doing here. They said, okay, God, we know how this goes. We're going to say, is it now? And you're going to say no. So we're not even, oh, what? Now? Okay, God. And so they packed their bags now in their 50s, and they went to one of these Stan countries as an engineer with an engineering firm, because they were able to leave everything functioning in Brazil just fine in the hands of one of the sons. And they went to this Stan. You're looking at me like I'm supposed to stop, but I got to end this story because it's a great story. I told her that she could cut me off at any time, but please don't cut me off in the middle of the story. All right. So what happens, they get to the stands, one of the stands, he begins to work as an engineer. And on one of his journeys, he's on an overnight bus ride because they have offices in 3 different cities, and you don't fly in that country because you have like a 75% chance of dying, but if you take the bus, it's only a 50% chance of dying. Forgive me if you're from one of those countries. I'm from one of those countries, and you got to pick your transportation mechanisms well. And so he's on an overnight bus ride. He's sitting next to a man. Remember, Marcos is a Brazilian Christian, and he's sitting next to a Muslim, predominantly Muslim context, and the man says, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" Because he's clearly a foreigner, Marcos was, and you don't go to that country unless you're a spy or doing something illicit or a missionary, which would actually be the worst of the 3 options probably. And so you're automatically suspect. And so Marcos says, "Well, I'm an engineer." And in a little bit of disbelief, the man says, "Well, what's the name of your firm?" And when Marcos said the name of the firm, the man had a literal physical expression on his face. He reacted, and Marcos says, "You know us? Have you heard of us? Why are you looking at me like that?" And the man then told Marcos this story, which I'm going to tell you right now, which is that man comes from a region of his country which is susceptible to earthquakes. And a few years prior to that, actually there had been a devastating earthquake, and in a village of 20 to 25,000 people, every single building in that village had been destroyed. And this Muslim man was saying, there was only one building that did not collapse. And it was the building that you Christians built. And he said, we Muslims built garbage for ourselves. I lost family members in that earthquake. I lost colleagues in that earthquake. I lost friends in that earthquake. Why is it so different? Why would you care to build something with excellence that wasn't even for your own benefit? Well, Marcos said, I'll be glad to tell you why I care. I'll be glad to tell you why we do things with excellence. Now, he actually was able to explain a Christian biblical understanding of what it means to know God through Jesus Christ. And that man, as far as we know, may not yet have ever professed faith in Jesus Christ, but he had a chance. He had an opportunity to understand what the fully lived out gospel looks like. And in this case, he understood it through business. He understood it through not just a person who was on mission, but who had a vehicle, which was the business, and that business was on mission. So we say business as mission.
Great, thanks a lot, João Mordomo. With our business coalition at the World Evangelical Alliance, we always try to connect these areas of business people, business ministries, and the various alliances, churches, church leaders. So unfortunately, especially in the European hemisphere or also Western civilization, we have a separation of tasks. So we have very successful companies and wealthy business owners who donate money to the NGOs and churches and church ministries. Yeah. So you bring a new aspect of that relation. How could we overcome that separation of tasks?
Yeah, that's great. Well, actually, it tends to be not merely a Western or developed world obstacle. If I could couch this or frame this just a little bit differently, well, it's the same thing. I'm just going to use different words. You're referring to, at least partly, a sacred secular dichotomy. So there's a dualism where we understand that you're sacred on Sunday and that Monday through Saturday or whatever your work week happens to be, that's a different thing. That's secular and it does not have any sacred value in it. That's a problem in Brazil. That's a problem in Latin America in general. And it's a problem where it's not necessarily based on culture. It can be cultural. There, a guy named Gerrit Hofstede did a study internationally in business organizational cultures about power distance, and there are some cultures who are oriented hierarchically. We know that. But the issue is more theological. The issue is related to the fact that where the gospel has arrived to places, it's arrived often in a Western packaging, and we're the ones that did a huge misservice, a misinterpretation of New Testament teaching and a disservice to the church, which is to say that you've got your clergy class over there, and then you've got your laity over there, and the clergy are the ones we all ought to aspire to, because they're the ones who are really chosen and blessed by God. And everybody else, you just go do whatever it is that you figure out how to do. and give your money to the clergy, and they'll figure out what to do with it. And so that would be maybe business for mission, where you generate an income, you give the money to a church or an NGO or a mission agency, and you let them figure out what to do with it. But God has given us all this privilege and call and responsibility with respect to stewardship, to steward resources, if not actually to generate those resources. And so business as mission says you're going to, as a business professional, potentially you could have more of an eternal impact than a religious professional, than a clergy. So many places in the world that are still needy of access to what the Bible teaches about God that have never had it, and a pastor can't go, and a conventional missionary can't go, but a business professional can. So the challenge to answer that question is we've got to reread, we've got to understand correctly our New Testament teaching. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, for example, that we're all a royal priesthood, a holy nation. We're all chosen by God and set apart so that we may declare His glory.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Do we have any further question here in the audience? Some comments on Facebook? Okay, yeah.
Hello, Matthias Straub. How do you pick the businesses, the sectors that the missionaries are in? How do you build them? How do you make them sustainable?
How do we pick them or how do we build them? Well, okay, so, all right, I'll see if I can answer that briefly. The first thing I would say is we would, gosh, how do I say this without sounding, you use the dichotomy that I was just talking about, and that's one of the things we're, sorry, that was real blunt, and I'll shake your hand afterwards and we'll be friends. I'm not trying to offend you. When we say, how do you get the missionaries to fit into business, and we're saying, okay, that is an approach, but in reality, we're saying everybody that's called and gifted to any type of professional activity, how do we fit them into the mission? And that's maybe even more significant. In fact, I would affirm that it is more significant to what we're trying to do. But then it still gets to that question. So part of it